If you really wanted, I guess, like notation, how to take notes and how to pass your exams in a very smart and efficient way, there are people like Ali Abdal and like, a lot of really great YouTube channels that work really well for that. But I guess if you're here, you're kind of done with that. But anyway, giving you variety, you're welcome. Hi, my name is Wani. I'm a philosophy student at L'Arc-Sorbonne, and today I'll be giving you tips and tricks into how to actually confront philosophical texts. Basically, this video will be kind of cut into 3 parts. The first is what inspired this video, which is Jonathan and Rohan, essentially from the practical experience that I had trying to guide people in book club on how to read L'avenir de Hegel, of The Future of Hegel by Malibu. Brought to light like how it is that one should actually learn how to read the text before actually thinking of reading the text. The second part of the video is going to be just like my quick tips. So if you're here just to have a gloss through, there's a timestamp somewhere for you to jump to that point. And the last is that I'll just give a quick walkthrough on how it is that I actually learned to confront text differently over time. So I will go through based on its chronology of when I've read them. So I think Spinoza I read about 2.5 years ago or 2 years ago, the Ethics. And then I read Hegel's Phenomenology last summer. And this summer I started, and I would say like I'm 1/3 through of Marx's Das Kapital. So I will show you the progression, or just talk a little bit about the progression of how it is that I've entered each text. This idea was brought to me by the Discord group. Mainly, there's this post that Jonathan posted about how it is that he took notes. And then after that, Rohan posted like a link to a bunch of different thinkers and how it is that they actually take their notes. So then I was just like, oh, I think that's pretty interesting. So I asked Jonathan if it was okay if I shared how it is that he writes notes, and he was down. So thank you, Jonathan. Essentially, let's just take the second and third quote that he wrote. And then after that, I would tell you how it is that, you have to keep this in mind, or I would recommend you keep this in mind for when you actually read philosophical texts. The difficulty here, I feel mainly it's because it's in English. I have made a lot of videos about how it is that I just have no idea how English speakers would think that they can actually understand Hegel. And it's not just a snub, but to be fair, like Zizek does a great job on Hegel's text. He doesn't lose the nuance of language. So one of the biggest things is that there's sein, which is être, which is being, and sein Ende, which is étant. So it's something else. It's like a being, but it's like a being belonging to something. And for the most part, when I looked at the English translation, it was just being, and you're just like, I have no idea how it is that one is able to understand, again, a lot of text in German if they read the English translation. But this book for book club that we're reading now is called The Future of Hegel, L'avenir de Hegel by Catherine Malibu. And I'm basically trying to, in this book club, teach methodology, not so much how to write, but how to read and understand. I guess there are a lot of tangents that I can go into, but let's just get to these 2 paragraphs that Jonathan kindly shared, which is in English, which is the English translation from the French, which also in French we have a lot more distinctions compared to in English. So let us begin with, what is proper to man is to maintain itself between, on the one hand, the animal's incapacity, and on the other hand, the perfect actualization, which is divine. For this reason, man is perfectly able to present the genus. So if you read this, I'm wondering if people would understand the relationship of this to Aristotle. Of course, this was under the chapter of like Aristotle, but it's really to highlight how it is that, what is animals' incapacity? And if you don't know Aristotle, you wouldn't know that animals' incapacity is simply our capacity as humans to speak. If you want to, see how it is that I actually broke down or explained Aristotle's conception of man in this series about, how do I name shit? I'll just link it below, but I'll just say like, this is where Aristotle's stuff lives. And essentially, very quickly, the idea of how it is that we have speech and we call it animals' incapacity, it just means that humans, according to Aristotle, instead of Descartes, are animals still, but how it's specified against animals is the fact that we have the capacity to speak our language compared to animals. And don't tell me that dolphins don't speak to each other. I know that's a separate thing, but just so that we can move on, I'm just trying to give you the idea of how it is that there's a lot of history based on a very simple thing of animals' incapacity. Because I asked the group and I asked, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And the first thing that comes to mind was reflection. Not wrong, but in the context of how it is that you're reading this text when she's talking about Hegel from the progression of Aristotle, it is not reflection, it is simply speech. And if you're thinking reflection, that's more of Descartes, and it's in the same video. I show like the distinction of how it is that Descartes defines subjectivity compared to how it is that Aristotle defines man. So the second part, which is perfect actualization, which is divine, it has to go with the not theological as in like the gods like theo, but theological as in telos, as in like goal or end or final, like it's like where we reach at the end. And the idea of the perfect actualization, which is divine, is just the idea of perfection in terms of completion, of in terms of actually achieving what it is that man is supposed to achieve, which is to become a political animal. Again, like this is really long, but it's just to give you an idea of how it is that it has to do with a very rich and dense idea of the history of Aristotle to Hegel. The other thing to also take into account is that, we should really stay away from this poeticism of, or the poetic element of philosophy. I think it's something that like, I myself, like when I write in English, and if you don't know, Sorbonne in Paris, all of my classes are taught in French, unless it's even my language classes are taught in French. But the idea is that for me, yes, it was very difficult. If you watch my other video that I'm gonna shoot after this about how it is that I take notes in class, I will explain a bit more about the full experience of trying to, or, having perseverance in the French system, learning philosophy. The good thing about it is that I don't come with this cultural baggage of what a word means. And it's the idea of like, that's why definitions are really important. I think we shouldn't take for granted that everyone has the same relationship or the same ideas behind any notion. But that being said, because I am working in French, I am really starting from baseline. If we ask questions like what is happiness or what is desire, you use these words almost every single day. Well, not happiness, but maybe want. What is a want? It's words that we use every day, but we don't really think about as deeply what it truly means. It's kind of just like, oh yeah, you kind of know what I'm saying, right? And like when we say that kind of completing phrase, like, right? You know what I mean? Stuff like that is most of the time, like, and stuff like that, it's for the most part, we don't actually know what we're saying, or we don't have an exact point. It's just kind of something that we, utility-wise, like if it gets the point across, for the most part, we just throw words out there. And I think just really quickly, like, my French will really improve if I take the time to slow down, to actually say what I want to say. And even in English, like, I think that's why philosophers, for the most part, speak really slowly or really fast. I think I watched Zizek talk about how it is that sometimes he speaks really quickly because he is intentionally trying to avoid being questioned of what it is that he's saying. And he did it in a funny way, but I think it's quite clear and honest of him to actually say that. But on the other hand, there are professors or people or philosophers that speak extremely slowly because they want to get the point across and they want it to be solid. So that's a bit of, psychology, I guess, of like how it is or why it is people present in different ways. To go into the second quote, which is, it's already 9 minutes. If you really wanted, I guess, like notation, how to take notes and how to pass your exams in a very smart and efficient way, there are people like Ali Abdal and like, a lot of really great YouTube channels that work really well for that. But I guess if you're here, you're kind of done with that. But anyway, giving you variety, you're welcome. So the second quote is, from the dawn of birth to the eternal night, first the child, then the youth full of ideas and projects, give way to the mature man, ripe but disenchanted, broken in by social obligations, finally to the old man, exhausted and driveling. So yeah, it sounds like poetic and stuff, but does it really have any content? Personally, I don't think so, but to each their own. But that's just my basic advice of like, when you're reading it, one should take into account the history. One should take into account the alignment. So we have the progression of Aristotle, Hegel, and then, understanding where Malibu comes into the context and her point of view is also really important. Someone said to me once that no one can escape my harsh critique of the personalities of philosophy. And I honestly take philosophers as authors, writers, but they just have a specific subject matter and they have like a specific purpose compared to, fiction writer. But the context and the point where a person writes will color how it is that one should understand the text, or at least the way that one could get a better context of how it is that the text is proposed. So the second part, which is basically a quick rundown of how it is that I would say to confront the text. The first tip is to just confront the text. I think I mentioned a few times how it is that my professor on phenomenology, and this is phenomenology from Descartes to Husserl to Heidegger, how it is that, we just had a funny semester, and in the end, like, a lot of people were just like, you didn't really explain anything about Heidegger. It was like just a teaser. But, you have to think about the limits of the professors. And, I think a lot about it when I think of the limits of video, of just like, go to this video, go to that video, because you can't say everything in one video. But the idea is that he literally said, just read the text. Stop bitching about it. Stop complaining of how hard it is. Stop complaining about how afraid you are, and just do the reading. To make you feel better, Wittgenstein says that it's probably one of the hardest activities to do, where it is that you're reading a term and you're trying to stick a concept to the term. And again, this is where context comes into account, and this is where guidance is really helpful. So whoever you choose to watch, whoever you choose to learn from, make sure that they actually have a good foundation in philosophy. If not, then they're just gonna give you basically like 20th, 21st century daily lingo stuff to kind of go like, this is how philosophy helps you in daily life. Like, no, don't do that. Get someone, or, if you are looking for a mentor, make sure that they actually go to a school that respects, the tradition. Not so much to just be like academia, but you have to understand how it is that things are written, the progression, the history, the context, and someone with rigor and that actually cares about the historicity of philosophy, so that they can give you a good base, so that you don't just mix up things and you have a clearer picture, essentially. So just confront the text. The second is that I've learned to make a glossary at the back. So what that means is that if I'm like, okay, in the future, I feel like this term is going to be really interesting for me, and the chances of me rewriting quotes is very low because there's just so much to read. If I had more leisure and time, or if I want to actually, truly understand the text, which is something that I'm doing with Spinoza's l'entendement, la traité de la réforme de l'entendement. I think that's the proper title. I'm rewriting it because sometimes when I rewrite, I get closer to the words, and that's why I like rewriting it, but there's just not enough time in the day. But it's the same as like when you go to a museum. You can just take a photo, or you can start sketching. Your sketch will not look like the beautiful artwork in front of you, but it'll force you to look at every detail of the artwork in front of you. Well, most of the details. It's the same way. Like, if you want to rewrite it, do that. I think it's a great practice if you have time, but you have to be efficient about it. I think I've learned a lot about there's so much to read, and you just have to prioritize things. So a glossary at the back is a very good compromise of like when you want to come back and then just refresh, you know exactly where to go to, and you're not like skimming every page trying to find it again. And I'll show you how it is that has changed over time, especially from Hegel to Marx, how I've taken notes, because with Spinoza, I really didn't, because that was like the very first book. Well, not the very, well, maybe was Spinoza's Ethics. Wouldn't it be so cool to say like, my first philosophy book that I read was Spinoza's Ethics? But anyway, the last thing that I would say was put everything in parenthèse. It's like, it's good that I wrote notes. So put everything in parenthèse is kind of like, don't try to use any of the information that you're reading. Just go like, when I read this beautiful thing, and Bergson writes really, really beautifully, I read this thing about repetition, and I was just like, wow, this is so beautiful. And like, the series that I just did on Schrödinger, I was like, wow, that is like so amazing. But if I just had the mindset of just like, I'm going to read this, or I'm going to make a video, I'm going to of course, like, you have an intention, right? I my friend said to me, like, when do you find the time to read the book from start to finish? And I'm just like, you just gotta find time. Because the thing is that for me, chronology helps with understanding the methodology of the person writing it. Because for the most part, it's to build their arguments. Chapter 1 usually builds to chapter 2 to build to chapter 3. And for me, when I'm reading, I can't really like skip to the part that I like, because I don't even know if the part that I like is sincerely the part that I like if I only project what I think the thing means. And also, you don't learn anything. Like the introduction for the book on Marx that I'm reading, I think the guy's name's Althusser, but he said that, like, do not read the first section of Das Kapital until the end. And that's so counterintuitive, but he said that, like, either you're going to be so fatigued by the complexity of it that you give up, or you're going to read it thinking that you've learned something, but in the end, you have not picked up anything worth learning or understanding. So if you are confronted by a text and it is difficult, you are changing your subjectivity. Like there's this like professor said, like there's a transformative aspect of reading. And I cannot agree more, because half the time you're staring at it and you're like, what are you trying to say? And this attempt to understand something is your brain doing the developing thing. So the confusion and the discomfort and the distress that you feel is genuinely a sign that you're on the right path. And then existential crisis is something else, but that's for another video. So that's what I want to say about parenthèse. Don't have a goal in mind and don't force to try to understand anything. Some things just take time to mull in the brain. And then when you come across something else, then it will remind you of this, and then you can make references. For me, for the most part, things are intelligible when you can compare them. And you can only compare things, or have a great understanding of things if you have a huge library to compare all these ideas. And the last thing I want to say is, like, I recently spoke to someone who's about to start her master's on big data, and she said that data needs to be simple, or else it'll take a lot of time because it requires more memory. And what I took away from that is that, yeah, okay, so that makes sense how it is that memory, and this is something that we talked a bit about book club, because Malibu mentioned something about memory as the mechanism for subjectivity. It's good to check. You don't want to just make shit up. No, so memory is the mechanism for intelligence. So this is actually makes more sense with the example I was giving about big data. And habit is the mechanism for a sense of self, a sentiment de soi. So in that way, what I'm trying to say is that this is supposed to be a difficult task. It is going to take a long time because you need big memory, and big memory means that you have a lot of information, or you're holding a lot of information, and that is part of becoming more and more intelligent. So it makes sense, takes time, difficult, all that stuff. So this is an example of me showing a comparison of something that we can understand in this way. I'm not saying that it's correct or right, but I'm saying that this analogy of memory for big data and memory for our memory in our brain, our spirit, our mind, wherever you want to put memory, because maybe it's not here, maybe it's somewhere else in the body, who knows? But the point is that through this comparison, I have demonstrated to you how it is that reading, learning, building intelligence takes time. Okay, part 3. So now I'm going to walk you through the 3 books that I read over time. As I said, Spinoza, Hegel, and Marx. I would say that my note-taking has been adaptive in terms of, how it is that they write in general, what it is that I've learned from them, where I'm at with my life at the time, and also just like, for Hegel, it's very dense. And it is, I feel like you really need to keep up with things. So then there's a lot more, you'll see, there's a lot more back notes compared to Marx. But again, I think it would just be easier if I start. So let me put this aside. So with Spinoza, you can see I segmented the 5 sections. It makes it easier for me to flip through them. Don't be super duper afraid, but it's because one side is in Latin and one side is in French. This is a copy that was recommended by my professor, because something that you will realize the more and more you get into philosophy seriously is that you have to take into account who's translating the books that you're reading. And for the most part, if you're into continental philosophy, you have to really be on it. You have to do your research on not only like who's the most respected, but who's the one who's most used. An example is for Hegel's phenomenology. I read from Bourgeois, And that's mainly because he's more modern than Hippolyte, but I don't know if it's a negative thing, but with Bourgeois, he's the person who directed the thesis of Malibu. Well, where's the book now? Yeah. He's the person who directed the thesis for Malibu. And he's basically like the person who modernized or gave like the most modern translation. There's like four, but he's the big dude. Essentially, the idea is that if you are a person who is in charge of translating the text, you usually have the final say of what it is that author is trying to say. It's the same as Bitbull here for quantum mechanics and Schrödinger. He's known as the person through who most people in France would understand Schrödinger. So unless you read German or English, your understanding of Schrödinger will only ever be through the eyes of Bitbull if you were French, essentially. And it's the same for anyone who wants to read Hegel who doesn't read German. You will never actually understand Hegel, let alone most Germans in general trying to understand Hegel. But the idea is that if you were actually to read in English, you're going to read it through the eyes of the person. So the long-winded thing is that there's Bourgeois, but there's also Hippolyte. And I haven't made the time, listen to the words, haven't made the time to read Hegel's phenomenology through Hippolyte. But yeah, it was just, I don't know if it's like a regret, but I learned it. The main thing is that I started. But sorry, back to Spinoza. So with Spinoza, I would say like there wasn't really much of a system. I think like I just highlighted based on how it is that I wanted to feel like I progressed. So first it was like a pink highlighter, and then it became green, and then at some point it became orange. It was just so that I can personally feel like I'm making progress through this giant book. I did do something like this, where it's like different colors for big words, and also like, the way that I categorize things in my brain is kind of like, okay, if this person is, he says admiration, and then after that he explains admiration, I do the orange. So even though he mentions it first here, in this context, this is the explanation. Here I do mépris, which is contempt. Mépris, which is contempt. I highlighted the main key ideas here in blue, just so that I know how the text is split up visually, so that when I come back to it, and also while I'm trying to process it, I'm able to understand it a bit better. Also, when something that's really, really interesting to me, or like, something that I remember from in class, the professor saying is probably one of the most fundamental lines of Spinoza, I will highlight it in red, just so that in the future I'm just like, okay, because I think I said this before, like I feel like philosophy, you're basically a lawyer, but you're not dealing with the sophism of lawyers. So this is the landmark phrase. C'est pourquoi il est établi par tout cela que nous ne nous efforçons vers rien, ne voulons, ne recherchons, ne désirons rien, parce que nous jugeons que c'est bon. Mais au contraire, nous jugeons qu'une chose est bonne parce que nous nous efforçons vers elle, la voulons, la recherchons et la désirons. So the phrase is, it is why it is established by all that we do not enforce ourselves towards nothing, not wanting, not searching, not desiring anything because we judge it to be good. But on the contrary, we judge something to be good because efforcer is like effort, but also like moving oneself towards it, wanting it, searching for it, desiring it. So essentially, desire comes before a value that's placed on the object. So it's not because we judge an object to be good, therefore we desire it, but it's much more about because we desire it, we judge it to be good. So this is like one of the landmark phrases. There's another one that I highlighted with this Hello Kitty sticker because we all have a past. But I'll probably read that for a video for members only, just because we're already recording for 33 minutes and we're only on Spinoza. I think the last thing I can say about this is that at the end, like, I'm not gonna show you because I also did write like my my to-do list, like Thursday Spinoza edit video, go to the bank, and then Friday it's like write a resume, call an Italian. Who am I calling in Italian? PDF, Buddhism. Oh yeah, that's my Gumroad. Anyway, my point is that I can't show you the back because it's like random shit. I did start doing this thing about, a little bit of a glossary, but not much. And I have like the fact that I have empty pages at the back shows that it's not something that I've started trying to do. So that is Spinoza. The second one that I've already kind of talked about was Hegel's phenomenology. I just slapped the book. But again, like I divided the book as before, just so that, you have a feeling of progression. A win is a win. It's kind of like, when you're an author, you have like the page count or the number count just so that you feel that even though the day felt endless, you still made a step forward. Also, like just a quick tangent, as administration or life stuff, when we want to get things done super immediately, I think it's important to remember that the fact that we're already in the process means that we are closer towards our goal, and to not be like, just because it's not finished, we didn't do anything. I say this for my own perfectionist self. So the new thing that I did in this book, I would definitely say, is my massive glossary. So yeah, it goes for every, essentially, like there would probably not be a single page that has been missed. And it keeps going, and I also, like, obviously you can tell like I've skipped a couple of pages. And then for this, it's this other thing, which is what I recommended before, which is to read something with a commentary. So this, for the most part, is both notes that I took from the commentary, but also, the glossary. So as you can see, like I kind of have like weird sections, and well, they're not weird, they're just me writing down what it is that I learned from the commentary that I was recommended by a professor. I'll put a photo of it here. It's by Marx. And what I will tell you though is that if you listen to my German professor, you will use the commentary of Kojève and not Marx. But I would say like both of them aren't proper commentaries because they kind of just picked something that they liked from each chapter and then went their own way. But it's still good to have a guide because it at least gives you a sense of whether it is that you're on track. But I think Hegel is one of the really good philosophers who gives you kind of like rewards and cookies in terms of like, now you're on the right track. Because for the most part, I don't think you can continue reading the phenomenology if you don't understand what came before it. And there always seemed to me to be a sensation. I think I mentioned this throughout my lives. That's also in my members only section. But essentially, it was just this idea that like, you're confused and you're wondering if you have the point, you understand the point. And there usually always is like a phrase that reaffirms you that you're on the right path. So I think that's really great writing. I know a lot of people say that Hegel is extremely confusing, but I don't, I mean, I was going to be really humble about it, but if you saw, my video on how it is I did for my finals, I got an 18 out of 20. So there is someone in the institution that tells me that I have a pretty good sense or intuition about Hegel. So yeah, making charts, trying to make things make sense. And this was something that Quentin brought out as well, which was really great because Quentin was the one who told me like, because I always ask for feedback about book club, right? Because sometimes you just forget where people stand, and because I've been, studying in La Sorbonne for a few years, you kind of forget where people begin in terms of philosophy. And he was the one who's just like, don't worry about taking too much time to explain to people how to read the text. And he also made a really good remark because Jonathan was asking for advice. And he said that like, rephrasing it or writing it in your own words is really, really helpful. And I 100% agree with that. Even if you have any thoughts that come to mind for it, it just shows that your mind is kind of reorganizing. And yeah, so that's a really good point to make. How it is that I redid this book is that you see like the pink, this one I remember because I ran out of pink really quickly, but pink usually is when I see the same phrase or the same word or a development of the word, I'll highlight it in pink because I feel like here's where it changed. And you're gonna see, well, you can't really see, but for the ones that I find extremely interesting, I would like, put a star. Like here is like Jouissance. So if you're into Freud, which I am obviously not, the idea is that if I go into a person's term or theory before someone else, I get more and more into the foundational elements of what jouissance means. And then, here, if I remember correctly, jouissance was really interesting in terms of like, you sacrifice something and then you eat this thing and then you partake in divinity. Hi, so I actually found the thing about Marquette and sacrifice et jouissance because it was like picking my brain. But essentially, what I wrote was Marquette kind of resumed the concept in the page where he defines sacrifice, page 104 of that book that I mentioned. So when I renounce something, when I sacrifice, je sacrifie, I make it sacred. Je le rends sacré. When I kill something, I at the same time make the thing sacred that God inhabits, and in eating it, I assimilate myself with divinity. Sacrifice realizes our jouissance, our awareness of our unity with essence, with totality. How is this not such a beautiful definition of jouissance, where it is our awareness of our unity with essence and totality? So if this idea is like interesting to you and you're wondering which Hegel live was it? It was week 6. I will put it in the description somewhere as week 6. I had like exclamation marks. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. Back to the video. That is my main progression with how it is that I took notes in terms of Hegel. And then really quickly with Marx. So Marx, as I said to you, the person who wrote the introduction said to skip the first, to do the second, the third, the fourth, skip the fifth, and in the end, like never come back to the fifth, but read the first section last. What I've been doing here is just writing like key concepts and terms towards the end. I'm pretty hopeful that it focused. Not that it would mean much to you because it's just more of a glossary for me. And I think like, you know, what it shows is that I have a little bit more confidence in terms of how it is that I put the information down, because before it's kind of like I was very afraid to lose where I was at. And the interesting thing as well about Hegel, before I move on too quickly, my professor for Hegel said that definitions for Hegel comes topologically. What that means, or logically, what that means is that it comes based on the context of each term and not so much chronologically. You know how I said like before, like, you know, I need to understand the beginning and then move on to the second, third. I still believe that that's a separate issue, but if you're reading Spinoza, it would be much more helpful if you did it chronologically, because we started with axioms, things that you cannot argue or change, the foundation blocks that you have to start with. It begins with the first axioms, and then everything else, it builds and it branches off. But with Hegel's phenomenology, it's kind of like you can go to a section and yes, like comparing how it is that terms are defined differently in different sections means something, but each term stands alone in its own meaning based on what section it's in. So that is the main thing that I want to say about Hegel in terms of progression or understanding. But yeah, apparently, you know, what I can say, which is really interesting, is that the critique for both books by people that I've read in terms of commentary is that both of them said that like their first, like the whole book of Hegel in general, like what is said about Hegel's phenomenology is that because it's his first, you know, book, like opus, it's kind of like he put everything in it, and that's why it's like super mega complex. But then with this one, it's kind of like the first section has the same vibe of like Hegel's phenomenology in terms of like it's extremely dense, it's extremely, you know, rich, and it's extremely complex. But the point is that, you know, that Marx comes after Hegel. He's extremely influenced by Hegel, and reading a bit of Marx up to this point, he's extremely Aristotelian as well. And I've mentioned a bit in book club how it is that there are certain thoughts that will not make sense. They won't be coherent with one another. So it's kind of like, you know, if you read Plato, the chances of you being able to be extremely Aristotelian in your thoughts is low. It's not impossible, because I myself, I love mixing different authors, and like, you know, there's always going to be some kind of commonality or similarity at some point. Even their differences is, you know, the thing that makes them similar. But my point is that like, you know, through understanding the heritage and the lineage of each philosopher, you kind of like have a sense of how it is that you might approach or understand each philosopher, something that I've already mentioned, but in a different context. The other thing that I would like to say is that apparently Hegel really digs Spinoza, as like apparently Hegel, according to Mackey, says that Spinoza is his favorite author, and also Schrödinger is extremely influenced by Spinoza, which is something that you'll see in my series that I probably published before this on the speculation of evolution. So, you know, it's quite clear that I dig Spinoza, they dig Spinoza, coherently, we're team Spinoza. But it's not impossible to like a bit, you know what I mean? I'm just saying that like there's a coherent sense about it. We shouldn't content ourselves with it, but I'm just trying to make a point. So yeah, I think the latest one, like it shows a bit more confidence. I don't have any colored highlighting in it. The other thing is that, I mentioned before in a very, very, very long video ago about how it is that you need to treat the book like it's your book and not be afraid to write in it. So I obviously write in my books. I rewrite, things that I think I try to understand. So I wrote, capitalists taking as property a determined quantum of free work. I think I was translating something so that I understand it better. A dozen is no longer worth more than 10. This is third section, chapter 11. And, he does a lot of math to show you how being paid overtime is still paying you too little. And, there's a whole math to that, which is amazing. The other thing is that capitalist does not recognize the unpaid labor plus value they are receiving, even thinking to be paying more. Yeah, so this is why, like that's the cool thing. It's like I read that and then it sparks like this thing in my brain, which happens to be exactly what it is that this thing was about. So that's why it's really helpful to write notes as well, to kind of like, implant it into different parts of your brain. I think last thing that I would like to say in general about notes, or in general about how it is that you don't have to be so married to your first reading, is that one of my professors said this, and I'll probably repeat this in my other video, but it's the idea that once you understand something, you don't have to be worried about memorizing it. So it's how when I said those things, even if I might not have the exact quote, especially the one on sacrifice on marqué, because my brain is only this big. But the idea is as well, like, as long as I kind of remember what it is that the idea is trying to say, or like the context of the definition, I can still mobilize the thought. Because in the end, with philosophy, yes, we are using old cases, as in like arguments that were made in the past by prominent philosophers. But in the end, if you truly want to call yourself a philosopher, you need to mobilize your ideas and your thoughts using the ones from the past. So there are a lot of friends that I know who like taught me, I think it's called like mnemonic devices, like things that help with your memory, on how it is that like, for a huge quote sentence, she remembers the first letter of every word in the sentence, and she can like, say them all out. She's someone who did prépa at Henri IV. If you know that, it's just an extremely intensive school. I was like, yeah, this is really helpful, but this is not something I'm gonna do. I usually just remember like the key idea of the phrase, where it's from, what book, what section of the book, which is very important so that people know where to find what it is that you're talking about. But for the most part, it's not so much, in my opinion, about memorizing the whole phrase, but knowing how to understand it and how to mobilize it. So I hope this was helpful, and if you have any other questions or any quotes that you actually would love to share, please share them down below, and I'll talk to you soon.